we have to show you in this session is a practical demonstration to try to illustrate the work that we put into formulating YaraVita and to try to highlight some of the benefits that correct formulation will give us. So everything that we're working with in product development is managed under the ISO 9001 quality system. So the procedures that we have in place cover the whole process, right from gathering the information to define a new product or project that we're working on, then on into the laboratory where we can put together the formulation to meet the nutrient requirements and any other parameters that we're asked to achieve. Then we'll do the testing for stability, mixability, etc. Once we have promising candidates from the laboratory, we'll then move on into the glass house where we're testing safety and efficacy. And then ultimately on into field trials. So that whole procedure is covered under the ISO 9001 quality system. So each new product that we bring to the market has been through that same stringent test procedure. So by the time we bring a product to the market, we've got a lot of information behind it and we can be confident about the claims and the recommendations that we're giving for the product. So a lot of the ideas for new products will come in from the market. So if we look back over the last 5 years or so, well over half of the new products that we've introduced have been as a response to someone in the market asking for that new product. So we like to think that we're very market responsive. So the way that the ideas will come into us in the laboratory is in the form of a list of requirements. So obviously we need to know the nutrient or the mix of nutrients that we're dealing with. We need to know the form of the nutrient or the product that we're trying to achieve. So is it a powder, a solution or a suspension concentrate? Then we need to know how the product is going to be applied. So most of YaraVita products will be folio applied, but we're also producing seed treatment products or fertilizer coating products, etc. And how the product is going to be applied probably has the most bearing on how we go about formulating it. So there are components that we would include in a folio product that would not be applicable to a seed treatment, for example. Obviously we need to know the crop that we're targeting and the timing of application that is proposed for the new product. One thing that is really critical for the folio products is for the target crop, for the timing of application that is proposed for the new product, we really need to understand which are the important agrochemicals that are going to be used on the crop at that timing. We appreciate that it is quite rare for the YaraVita product to be sprayed on its own. It's not really economical for the farmer to do that, so typically he will be tank mixing the YaraVita nutritional product with an agchem. So it's critical that we know which are those important agrochemicals, and knowing that we can then build in tank mixability during the formulation process. So once we have all that information gathered together to define the product that we're working on, then the first stage in actually developing a new formulation is to consider the raw materials, the basic chemicals that we're going to build this formulation on. So the first part of the demonstration that we have to show you is to try to illustrate the large differences in quality and performance within just one type of chemical raw material. So when we're thinking about raw materials, there are various parameters that we'll take into consideration. So firstly, we're interested in the nutrient content or the elemental content of the raw material. That is going to have a bearing on the nutrient content of the final product. Then, if we're looking to produce a soluble powder or a solution type product, then the solubility of the raw material is really critical. On the other hand, if we're looking to produce a suspension concentrate or flowable product, then rather than the solubility of the raw material, the most important thing that we'll take into consideration is how well it will suspend in water, so suspensibility of the material. And linked very closely to that would be the particle size of the material. And then lastly, very important for the micronutrient materials, would be the purity, particularly in relation to the levels of toxic heavy metals. So, as an example, if we were asked to produce a copper suspension concentrate product, then one potential starting material that we might consider using as the basis for the product would be copper oxide. So we've got 3 different grades of copper oxide to show you. So copper oxide, like most of the materials we would be using as a basis for the suspension concentrate products, is essentially insoluble in water. So as I go through the demonstration and I mix these grades of copper oxide into the beakers of water, we're not looking for the copper oxide to dissolve. It's not going to dissolve however long I stir the beaker. What we're looking to happen is for it to form a suspension. And this is what is happening when a farmer is using one of the YaraVita suspension concentrates in his spray tank. He's forming a suspension of solid particles. So, first of all, we may identify copper oxide number 1. So this one is black copper oxide or cupric oxide. It contains 77% elemental copper, and visually it looks to be a very fine powder. So you may imagine that this grade will suspend okay in water. But if I take some of this material and mix it into the beaker of water, as I stir the copper oxide, it wets out, disperses, forms a suspension, but as soon as I stop stirring, this grade of copper oxide begins to settle out. So already, I think you will be able to see a lot of the copper oxide already sitting at the bottom of the beaker. Over the next minute or so, all the rest of the copper oxide will settle out and this will just be clear water, and all the copper oxide will be sitting at the bottom of the beaker. So the problem we have with this grade of copper oxide is, even though visually the grade looks a very fine powder, if we were to actually measure the particle size of that grade of copper oxide, we would see that we have a distribution between about 50 to 100 micrometers or microns. So a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter, so it's a small particle, but it is not small enough to stay in suspension for any length of time. And obviously, if this happens, this rate of settlement happens in the grower's spray tank, there's a danger that you're going to block the booms and the spray nozzles. Also, a particle at the top end of that range, 100 microns, is large enough itself to begin to block the filters and the spray nozzles in the sprayer. So all round, that grade of copper oxide would not be suitable to make a YaraVita product from. So we would reject that grade and move on to something possibly more suitable. So next, we may come to copper oxide number 2. So number 2 is red copper oxide or cuprous oxide. So this one has 86% elemental copper. And if we measure the particle size on this grade, we see we have an average of just 2 microns. So much finer than copper oxide number 1. So logically, you would think a smaller particle size, this grade should suspend better in the water. But if we take this material and mix it into the beaker of water, what we see is that it doesn't even disperse or wet out, it just forms lumps that sink straight to the bottom of the beaker. And if we can take out one of these lumps, you still see this is just still a dry powder. So the problem we have with this grade of copper oxide is that even though the primary particle size is very, very small, around about average of a couple of microns, the problem is that the surface character of this grade of copper oxide is hydrophobic. So when we put it into the water, rather than the particles separating and dispersing, they just clump together and then sink to the bottom. So for a product that we'd be intending to use in a water-based system, in the farmer's spray tank, this is not going to be suitable. So again, we would reject that and move on to something more suitable. So then we come to copper oxide number 3. So this one is the same chemical as number 2. So it's red copper oxide or cuprous oxide. It has the same copper content, 86% elemental copper, and it has the same particle size. average of a couple of microns. But take this material and mix it into the beaker. What we see with this grade, it wets out, disperses, forms a suspension, and in this case the particles are small enough that will stay in suspension for a relatively long period. So in this case we have the combination of the very fine particle size that we need linked to a hydrophilic surface character to the particles. So when they hit the water, the particles wet out, disperse, and then they're small enough to stay in suspension for a relatively long period. The reason for showing this demonstration is that in a lot of markets, because of health and safety regulation or because of fertiliser regulation, we're quite often obliged to disclose on the label or in the safety data sheet the active ingredients in the YaraVita product. And this will sometimes beg the question from the farmer, why should I pay for the YaraVita product? I can buy copper oxide or zinc nitrate or manganese sulfate or any of these other micronutrient materials cheaper than the YaraVita product. So part of our answer to that question would be then, well, not all grades of copper oxide or any of these other micronutrient materials are bound to behave the same. This demonstration shows that within one type of chemical raw material you can get a vast difference between the quality and performance between different grades. So a farmer is not in the position to be able to distinguish between the grades that will work and those that won't. For example, in a written specification, those two grades of copper oxide look almost identical. So the copper content is the same, the particle size is the same, the purity is the same, but they behave completely differently. So if the farmer bought that one, then he may be lucky and he gets away with it, but if he buys this one, it's going to block his spray equipment, it's not going to be an efficient treatment onto his crop. So we've been through the process to identify the best raw materials for a particular application. So with the YaraVita product, you can be sure that the product is going to do what we claim it will do. But that's not all. The YaraVita product is a lot more than just the raw materials. So selecting the best raw materials for a particular application is the critical first step, but then on top of that we also have the formulation, which will enhance the performance of the active ingredients. Also all the support that is behind the YaraVita product, so the tank mix information, the agronomic trials data, and also the product stewardship. So the YaraVita product is the whole package, not just the raw materials, but selecting the best raw materials for a particular application is the critical first step in making a successful product. Another important factor that we need to consider for raw material selection is purity. And by purity we're really meaning the levels of toxic heavy metal contaminants in the materials. So this is particularly important for the micronutrient compounds. And this is because in nature the natural minerals or ores or metals like zinc or manganese or copper are quite often found in association with the ores of toxic metals, so things like lead, cadmium, arsenic, mercury. So if we take zinc as an example, virtually every natural zinc deposit found around the world, you also find cadmium. So there's no avoiding some degree of contamination of the micronutrient metal compounds with these toxic heavy metals. But what we can do by working closely with our suppliers is make sure that the levels of those toxic heavy metal contaminants are as low as practically achievable. So in order to achieve that, here at Pocklington we're using a lot of non-standard fertiliser grade raw materials. So a lot of the materials that we're using here to manufacture YaraVita would be food grade or technical grade or in certain cases pharmaceutical grade raw materials. So if we take our zinc suspension Zintrac as an example, the zinc oxide raw material that we use to manufacture Zintrac is pharmaceutical grade. So it's the same material that you might see in cosmetics or in a mineral supplement for human consumption or in a cream to apply to a baby. With all of these products, if you look at the ingredients list, you will see zinc oxide pharmaceutical grade, and that is the same material that we're using as the basis for Zintrac. And just to show how pure that material is, here we have the grade of zinc oxide that we're using in YaraVita, and on the label we have the limits for the heavy metal contaminants. So we have a maximum limit for 20 parts per million lead, 5 parts per million cadmium, 1 part per million arsenic. So you can see there is some very low levels of these heavy metal contaminants in this high purity zinc oxide, but the levels are very, very low. And just to put that into context, this is another grade of zinc oxide. So this one is an animal feed grade zinc oxide. So it's compliant with the European regulation to allow this to be used in an animal feed supplement. And again, on the label we have the limits for the heavy metal contaminants. And in this case we have a limit of 400 parts per million lead, 20 parts per million cadmium, 100 parts per million arsenic. So many times higher than the levels that we have in the grades that we're using in YaraVita. Another example of the high purity materials that we're using in YaraVita would be phosphoric acid. So phosphoric acid is an important raw material in a lot of the solution type liquids, so a lot of the phos products. So Magphos, Senphos, Solatrel, this sort of product are based on phosphoric acid. So the grade that we're using here in Pocklington is white phosphoric acid or food grade, as opposed to the typical green phosphoric acid that would be conventionally used in fertiliser manufacture. And you can see the difference visually between the grade that we're using in YaraVita and the normal fertiliser grade, so far higher purity. So this grade, the one that we're using, the white phosphoric acid, is the same material that might be used in things like Coca-Cola, for example. So the reason we're pushed into using these very high purity raw materials is twofold, really. So on the one hand we have regulations. Fertiliser regulations in different countries will specify limits for heavy metal contaminants, and obviously we need to meet these most stringent regulations in the different countries around the world. But beyond the regulatory side, we also appreciate that there is pressure onto growers to demonstrate to their end users, so to supermarkets or food processing companies, that they have very low levels of residue on their crops, particularly for fruit crops and vegetable crops. So if we can show to the farmer we're using very high purity materials, and we can show our traceability through the production process, that gives the farmer the confidence to use the YaraVita product, knowing he's not going to have an issue with heavy metal residues on his crops. So once we've identified the best raw materials for a particular application, we then come on to the actual formulation process. So by formulation we mean adding other components, things like wetters, stickers, uptake agents, suspending agents. All these other co-formulants are helping the active ingredient do its job more effectively. So they may improve things like uptake of the nutrient through the leaf, or they might improve crop safety, or mixability with agrochemicals, or maybe some aspect of handling the product, so making it easier to pour, stopping it freezing in winter, for example. So we have a whole range of different co-formulants that we use in YaraVita, and we'll just show you one typical example, which is a wetter. So you may remember that pure water has a high surface tension. So the high surface tension of water creates a number of problems if we were to spray an unformulated product onto a crop. So I'm just dripping out some coloured water onto this paper, and the high surface tension is making the droplets contract to an almost spherical shape that sit up on the surface of the paper. And in a similar way, if we were to spray an unformulated product onto a crop, if we imagine this to be the surface of the leaf, the high surface tension of the water makes the droplets that land on that leaf surface contracts to this almost spherical shape. So we get discrete droplets sitting up on the leaf surface, like we have on the paper. So what this means, firstly, is that we only have a small surface area through which all the water in that droplet can evaporate from. So this means that drying time is extended. So if there is any adverse weather conditions, such as wind or rain, soon after the farmer sprays his crop, then we can lose a lot of the treatment from the leaf surface. Also, because of the way that the droplet is contracting and sitting up on the leaf surface, we only have this small area of contact between the droplet and the leaf. So all the nutrient in this droplet is focused on one small point of the leaf surface. And this can give rise to phytotoxicity or scorch at the point of contact. Also, we only have this small leaf area through which the nutrient can be absorbed. So it's an inefficient way to deliver the nutrient through the leaf. In a sunny climate, the shape of the droplet can act like a lens and focus sunlight onto the leaf, and we can have a sunburn effect. So all around, these problems are created by the high surface tension of the water. So what we can do in the formulation process to address those issues is incorporate a wetter or surfactant. So I've just add a couple of drops of wetter into this water. Give that a mix. So what the wetter does is lower the surface tension, and that spreads the droplet. So again, if you imagine that to be the surface of the leaf, by including the wetter in the formulation, we lower the surface tension and that spreads the droplet. So immediately we get a larger surface area through which the water can evaporate. So drying time is shortened, and other co-formulants like stickers can take effect, and the treatment becomes rain fast on the leaf surface. Also, we have extended the area of contact between the droplet and the leaf, so we're spreading the concentration of nutrient over a wider leaf area, so we've got less chance of phytotoxicity or scorch at the point of contact. Also, we have this wider leaf area through which the nutrient can be absorbed, so it's a more efficient way to deliver the nutrient through the leaf. We've also broken that lens effect, so less chance of sunburn. So this is one typical example of a co-formulant, the wetter. So here at Poplinton we've got quite a flexible production unit. We're able to make a variety of different types of products. So we have powder products, we have the clear solution type liquid products, and then we have the suspension concentrate or flowable products. So at one extreme are the powders. So we have soluble powders and also wettable powders, some single nutrient powders, and then multi-nutrient powders. So the big advantage of the powder formulations is the concentration of nutrient that we can achieve in this sort of formulation. But the disadvantage, and the reason why over the years there's been a trend away from powders towards liquids, so that now powders only represent maybe 10% of our production volume at Poplinton. The disadvantage of the powders is that they're not so easy or convenient to use. So with a powder formulation, the farmer's having to put a degree of work into dissolving or suspending the powder in the spray tank. He's having to weigh out powder rather than measuring the volume of a liquid. There might be a dust hazard associated with using the powder. So all around, powders very good for concentration, but not so good for ease of use. So at the other end of the scale, we have the solution type liquids. Again, we have single nutrient liquids and multi-nutrient, quite often crop specific liquids. So with this sort of formulation, the clear liquid solutions, the nutrient is already dissolved in the product. So when it comes to using the product, the farmer is pouring it into his spray tank, it's just diluting something that is already dissolved. So that makes it very easy to use and dilute. Also, with a liquid, he can measure volume rather than weighing out the powder. There's no dust hazard. And if it's a large-scale farm, then he can automate his process because the product is pumpable. So all around, liquid products are far easier, more convenient to use than the powders. But the disadvantage of this technology, the solution liquids, is that the concentration of nutrient that we can achieve in a solution is a lot lower than we can achieve in a powder. We're limited by the solubility of the nutrient sources. So we have to have an appreciable amount of water in the product to dissolve the nutrient, and this limits the concentration that we can achieve. So solution type liquids, good for convenience but not so good for concentration. So a number of years ago we came up with the idea of trying to combine the concentration of the powders with the convenience of the traditional solution type liquids, and we did that by introducing the suspension concentrate or flowable products. So now we have a full range of suspension concentrates, again single nutrient suspensions like Zintrac, or multi-nutrient, quite often crop specific formulations like Ramitrel or Grasitrel. So what we have with this sort of product is a liquid formulation, but rather than being a solution, it's a suspension. So the nutrient in a suspension concentrate is in the form of very small particle size solid powder that is held in a water-based suspension. And using this approach, we're not limited by the solubility of the raw material, and that allows us to get a much higher nutrient content in a liquid form. So approaching the concentration of the powder formulations, but with all the convenience of the traditional solution type liquids. But to make these very high concentration stable suspensions requires more sophisticated machinery in the factory, so we need high speed, high shear mixing vessels to create the suspensions, and we also need more sophisticated formulation chemistry. So we'll show you some of the additional co-formulants that we need to manufacture the products like Zintrac, for example. So the challenge that we have in making something like Zintrac is that the product itself does not contain a lot of water. So just to illustrate that point, here we have half a litre of Zintrac 700, and next to it we have in this cylinder the powder active ingredient, the zinc oxide raw material, that goes into that half litre. So the volume of the final liquid product is actually smaller than the volume of the powder active that goes into it. So you can appreciate that in that half litre there is not a lot of water. And just to illustrate that a little further, if we were to mix together the zinc oxide raw material and the water in the same proportion that we have in the final liquid product, then this is the sort of consistency of mixture that we achieve, a real thick paste. And in that condition, not particularly easy to use. So in that mixture, there is less water than there is active ingredient. So obviously the farmer cannot use the product in that form. So to get that into a liquid form, there are two things we could do. We could add more water into the mixture and eventually it will become fluid. But if we add more water, we dilute the concentration, and that's going against what we're trying to achieve. So what we do in the formulation process to make this paste into a liquid but maintain the concentration of nutrient that we're aiming at is to use what we call a dispersing agent. So I'll just add a small amount of dispersing agent into this mixture. You just give this a mix around. So just that small addition of dispersing agent turns the paste into a liquid. So what the dispersing agent is doing is coating the particles, giving the particles a negative charge, and in the concentrated mix the particles then act like magnets of the same polarity and mutually repel, and that allows them to flow against each other and turns the paste into a liquid. But we can't just leave the formulation like that. At that stage in the process the consistency is like water, very low viscosity, and if we leave it like that very quickly the particles in the mixture will just settle out. And with our suspension concentrates, we're given a 2-year shelf life. So to achieve that shelf life, we need to slow down the settling process, and that requires more formulation. So having made the mixture very, very thin, low viscosity, in order to achieve the stability that we need and the shelf life that we need, we have to increase the viscosity, thicken up the product to suspend the particles. So what we do to achieve that is use a thickening agent. So to illustrate how that works, if we leave the product like I've just made, like water, if you imagine that to be a particle of the zinc in the zintrap, we leave it like water, very, very quickly the particles will just settle out. But by including a thickening agent to increase the viscosity of the mixture, this holds up the particles and slows down that settling process. In the formulation process, we can't completely stop the settlement, so this ball is still falling, albeit very, very slowly. So it's normal over the 2-year shelf life of a suspension concentrate that we will get a concentration gradient developed down the pack. So this is a critical difference between a suspension concentrate and a solution. The solution, if the pack is sealed and it's kept in good conditions, it will stay like this indefinitely. Whereas the suspension concentrate, gravity will always pull down the solid particles in the mixture. So it's normal to develop a concentration gradient down the pack. So it's critical that before you use the suspension concentrate, you shake the product, shake the pack. That will return everything back into suspension and also thin out the product and make it easy to pour. So that is a critical difference and a message to get across to the farmer, to shake the pack before you pour it. So with suspension concentrate technology, we achieve a variety of benefits compared to other types of formulation. And one big benefit that we achieve is the concentration of nutrient that we can achieve in a liquid product. So this is an illustration of that point. These 3 tubes contain 3 different types of manganese formulation. So we have Mantrap Pro, our suspension concentrate formulation. We have a solution type liquid based on manganese sulfate, and then we have a chelate powder, manganese EDTA powder. And each of the 3 tubes contains the same amount of elemental manganese. We have 10 grams of manganese in each tube. So with Mantrap Pro, we just need 20 millilitres to deliver that 10 grams of manganese. With the solution, we need about 3.5 times the volume to give us the same 10 grams of manganese. And with the chelate powder, we need about 6 times the volume to give that same 10 grams of manganese. So in the practical situation, what that means with the suspension concentrate product is that we have lower application rates, we have less product to transport or warehouse, and at the end of the process, we have less packaging to dispose of. So big benefits compared to other types of formulation. So at the end of the formulation process, what we achieve with the suspension concentrates are liquid formulation, very high nutrient content, which are really easy for the farmer to disperse into his spray tank.